The first time my brother told me I would always need them, it was in front of everyone that mattered. My parents, relatives, and even strangers watched as he quietly dismantled my dignity, reducing years of sacrifice into a single humiliating sentence. We were at a large family reunion in our hometown near Denver. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the backyard where everyone gathered for a celebration of Andrew's recent promotion. He stood by the grill, a beer in his hand, looking like the king of the world. I had just mentioned that I was looking for a small apartment after losing my job at the design firm. Andrew didn't even look up as he flipped a burger. He just chuckled and said, "Don't bother, Natalie. You'll always need us to keep a roof over your head. You just aren't built for the real world." The silence that followed was heavy and cold. The worst part of that moment wasn't actually what Andrew said. It was how easily everyone around that table agreed. My mother nodded while sipping her wine, and my father just sighed, looking at me with a mixture of pity and disappointment. In that instant, I realized I wasn't seen as a person with potential or a woman with dreams. I was seen as a permanent burden, a ghost in the house that they had to tolerate. I was the invisible daughter in a family that worshipped my older brother. Andrew was their absolute pride. He was confident, successful, and very loud about every single achievement he earned. I was the quiet one who stayed behind, the one who helped with chores, who sacrificed my weekends to care for our aging grandparents, and who never asked for the spotlight. When my career collapsed due to a company-wide layoff, they didn't see someone struggling. They saw a failure. Andrew stepped in that evening, but it wasn't to help me rise or offer a hand. He did it to remind me exactly where he believed I belonged, beneath him. He spent the rest of the night talking about how he had planned my life out. He suggested I move into the damp basement of his new house to act as a part-time nanny for his kids. He spoke as if my life was over at 26, as if I had no agency left. Humiliation has a very strange effect on the human soul. It can break you into tiny pieces, or it can sharpen you like a blade. As I sat there listening to them laugh about my unfortunate luck, I felt a spark ignite deep inside me. I chose silence right then. It wasn't a sign of surrender, but a strategy of observation. I stopped defending my choices. I stopped explaining my plans. I just watched. While they mistook my quiet nature for weakness and defeat, I began building something none of them could possibly see. Every dismissal from Andrew became fuel for my fire. Every insult my mother whispered about my lack of drive became a blueprint for my future. I spent my days at the local library, using their high-speed internet to take every free coding and business course I could find. I stayed up until the sun rose, working on a freelance platform under a different name. I was Natalie Whitaker at home, the girl who couldn't keep a job. But online, I was a rising star in data architecture and remote systems. I saved every single penny, hiding it in an account they didn't know existed. I ate the simplest food and wore old clothes, letting them believe I was penniless and desperate. It was the hardest role I ever had to play. 3 months after the reunion, Andrew called a family meeting in his pristine living room. He wanted to finalize the basement arrangement. He had a contract drawn up, a real legal document, that required me to work 30 hours a week as a domestic assistant in exchange for room and board. My parents sat on his leather sofa, looking relieved that their problem daughter was finally being handled. Andrew handed me a pen with a smug grin that made my skin crawl. "Sign it, Nat," he said. "It's the only way you'll have any security. You know you can't make it on your own." I looked at the paper, then at the people who were supposed to love me. I didn't sign it. Instead, I told them I had found a small house-sitting gig out of town and would be leaving the next morning. They laughed, convinced I'd be back in weeks. I moved to a tiny, one-room studio in a city 3 hours away. It was a place where no one knew the name Whitaker and no one expected me to fail. For 2 years, I worked 16 hours a day. I transitioned from freelance tasks to building a proprietary software tool that helped logistics companies track shipments more efficiently. It was a niche market, but I saw the gap clearly. I lived on coffee and determination. My brother would call occasionally, always starting the conversation with, "So, are you ready to admit you're starving yet?" I would just smile at the phone and say I was doing fine. He would scoff and remind me that his basement door was still open, but the offer wouldn't last forever. He didn't know I was already making more in a month than he made in an entire year at his corporate office. The separation gave me the clarity I needed to stop seeking their approval. I realized that my family's love was conditional on my being inferior to Andrew. If I wasn't the failure, then Andrew couldn't be the star. It was a toxic ecosystem that I had finally escaped. My software, which I named Vantage Point, started getting attention from major investors. I was quiet about my success, not out of fear, but because I wanted the foundation to be unbreakable before I revealed anything. I hired a small team of developers who were as hungry as I was. We worked in a converted garage, far from the polished towers Andrew frequented. I felt a sense of peace I had never known. I was finally building my own castle, brick by invisible brick, while my brother was busy bragging about a promotion that was actually quite hollow. By the third year, Vantage Point was being used by 50 major firms. I was no longer just a developer, I was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech company. I bought a home that looked out over the mountains, a place filled with light and silence. My parents still thought I was doing some secretarial work in the city. I let them believe it. I even sent them a little money each month, which they accepted while telling me to be careful not to spend it all on frivolous things. The irony was almost too much to handle. Then, the news broke. A massive global logistics firm offered to buy Vantage Point for a staggering sum. The deal was finalized on a Tuesday morning. I sat in a boardroom surrounded by lawyers, realizing that I would never, ever need to hear Andrew's basement offer again. A few months after the sale, I received an invitation to my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. It was to be a grand affair, hosted by Andrew at an expensive country club. I knew this was the moment the truth would likely surface, but I wasn't nervous. I was settled. I drove to the event in a modest car, still not wanting to flaunt what I had built. When I walked into the ballroom, the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sound of a string quartet. Andrew was at the center of a circle of people, holding court as usual. When he saw me, he broke away and walked over, his eyes scanning my simple dress. "Well, look who made it," he said loudly. "Did you take the bus, or did your little secretarial job finally give you a bonus for a rental?" I just smiled at him, the same calm smile I had used for years. I drove myself, Andrew. "Happy anniversary, Mom and Dad." My parents hugged me, but their eyes were already drifting back to Andrew. He began a long, winding speech about family and success. He spent 10 minutes talking about his own career and how he had supported the family through tough times. He even pointed at me and said, "And we're so glad Natalie is finally standing on her own 2 feet, even if the shoes are a bit worn." A few people chuckled, and my mother patted my hand condescendingly. I felt the old sting of their dismissal, but it didn't hurt like it used to. It felt like watching a movie I had seen 1,000 times. The plot was predictable, the characters were stagnant, and the ending was already written in my bank account. The evening took an unexpected turn when a man named Mr. Henderson, a well-known investor in the region, approached our table. Andrew's posture immediately changed. He stood up straight and put on his most professional face. "Mr. Henderson, I didn't know you were a member here," Andrew beamed, extending his hand. Henderson ignored Andrew's hand and looked directly at me, his face lighting up with genuine respect. "Natalie, is that you? I didn't realize you were a Whitaker from this area." The table went dead silent. Andrew's hand hung in the air, forgotten. My parents looked back and forth between me and the billionaire investor. "I am," I said quietly. "It's good to see you, Bill." Andrew stammered, You know my sister? She does office work in the city." Henderson laughed, a deep, hearty sound that echoed through the ballroom. "Office work." Henderson looked at Andrew like he was insane. "Natalie Whitaker is the founder of Vantage Point. She just orchestrated the biggest tech exit the state has seen in a decade. Every major logistics firm in the country is running on her code." My mother dropped her fork, the clatter loud against the fine china. My father leaned forward, his face turning a strange shade of pale. Andrew looked like he had been struck by lightning. He kept opening and closing his mouth, but no words came out. Henderson continued, oblivious to the family drama he had just detonated. "I tried to buy into her company 3 years ago, but she was too smart to give away equity early. Most disciplined CEO I've ever met." He turned back to me. "We're having a private dinner next week with the governor. I'd be honored if you attended." I thanked Mr. Henderson and agreed to the dinner, keeping my voice level and calm. When he finally walked away, the silence at our table was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. Andrew was staring at me as if I were a stranger who had just broken into his house. Finally, my father whispered, "Natalie, is that true? Vantage point. That was you." I took a sip of water and nodded. "Yes, Dad. I've been building it since the year I lost my design job. The year you all thought I was a failure." My mother reached out to touch my arm, her voice shaky. "But you didn't say anything. We thought you were struggling. We would have helped you." I looked her in the eyes. "No, you wouldn't have. You wanted me to sign a contract to be Andrew's nanny. You wanted me in a basement." Andrew finally found his voice, but it was high and strained. "You lied to us. You let us believe you were nothing while you were sitting on millions. How could you be so selfish?" The sheer arrogance of his statement was almost impressive. "I didn't lie, Andrew. I just stopped explaining myself to people who didn't believe in me. You told me I would always need you. I decided to prove that I would never need anyone again." Andrew stood up, his face red with a mixture of anger and deep embarrassment. He looked around the room, realizing that several other guests were now whispering and looking our way. His image as the successful Whitaker had vanished in a single conversation. He tried to reclaim some dignity by saying he was happy for my luck, but the word luck tasted like ash in the air. The rest of the night was a blur of uncomfortable apologies and forced smiles. My parents tried to sit closer to me, suddenly interested in every detail of my life. They asked about my house, my car, and my future plans. Andrew, however, grew strangely quiet. He spent most of the night at the bar, avoiding the gaze of the people he had been bragging to just an hour before. I realized then that my success didn't just prove him wrong, it dismantled his entire identity. He couldn't be the great protector if I was more powerful than him. He couldn't be the star if I was the sun. I felt a strange sense of pity for him, but it was quickly replaced by a profound feeling of freedom. I left the party early, driving back to my light-filled home in the mountains, feeling completely and utterly light. Weeks passed, and the frequency of calls from my family increased. My mother called to talk about upgrading their lifestyle, mentioning that their roof was leaking and their car was making a strange noise. My father called to ask for investment advice, though it was clear he was looking for a handout. But the most surprising call came from Andrew. He sounded different, humbled, almost desperate. He didn't mention the basement. He didn't mention his promotion. Instead, he told me that his firm was undergoing a massive restructuring. He had been let go after 10 years of service. He was in deep financial trouble, having leveraged his lifestyle on the assumption that his bonuses would never stop. He was facing foreclosure on his house, the one with the basement he had so graciously offered me. The tables had turned completely. "Natalie," Andrew said, his voice cracking over the phone. "I didn't know who else to call. The bank won't listen, and Mom and Dad don't have the funds. I was wondering if you could help. Just a bridge loan to get us through the next few months." I sat in my office, looking out at the mountains, remembering that contract he had tried to make me sign. I remember the smirk on his face and the way he had dismantled my dignity in front of strangers. I didn't feel a surge of vengeful joy. I just felt a deep, tired realization of how fragile his strength had always been. "Andrew," I said quietly, "I'm sorry to hear that, but you told me once that the real world is a tough place. I think you need to figure this out on your own, just like I did." Andrew began to beg. He talked about his kids, about the shame of losing his home, and about how he had always looked out for me in his own way. It was a pathetic display of a man who had never actually built anything of substance, only an image. I realized that if I gave him the money, I would be participating in the same toxic cycle that had almost destroyed me. I would be the provider, and he would be the burden, and the resentment would only grow. "I can't give you a loan, Andrew, but I can put you in touch with a great career counselor and a financial advisor I know. They can help you restructure your life." He hung up on me in a fit of rage, calling me cold and heartless. He still didn't get it. He still thought he was entitled to my labor. My parents were furious with me for turning my back on family. They visited my home for the first time, and instead of being happy for my success, they spent the whole afternoon lecturing me on my responsibilities to my brother. "He's your blood, Natalie. How can you live in this mansion while your brother is losing everything?" my mother cried. I stood my ground. I lived in a studio apartment for 2 years and worked 16-hour days. Andrew spent those years buying luxury cars and mocking me. He chose his path. I chose mine. I am not his safety net. They left in a huff, and for a few days, the silence was blissful. I realized that by refusing to be the victim, I had also refused to be the savior. I was just Natalie, and for the first time, that was enough. The truth finally surfaced about Andrew's restructuring. It wasn't just a corporate layoff. He had been caught cutting corners and mismanaging client funds to maintain his lifestyle. It wasn't revenge that destroyed him. It was his own arrogance and the belief that he was above the rules. The legal fees alone were draining what little he had left. My parents were forced to sell their own house to help him stay out of jail. They moved into a small, cramped apartment, the very kind they had mocked me for living in. I watched from a distance as their world collapsed under the weight of the lies they had all lived by. I didn't celebrate. I just observed. The same certainty that made them mock me had blinded them to the reality forming quietly behind them. Arrogance is a very dangerous blinder. I never confronted Andrew again. I didn't need to. I didn't need a dramatic showdown or a moment where he apologized on his knees. The most powerful moment of my life wasn't proving him wrong to his face or seeing him lose his status. It was the quiet realization as I sat on my deck watching the sunset that I no longer needed him or their approval at all. Their opinions of me had become like background noise, easily ignored and entirely irrelevant to my reality. I had built a life based on truth, hard work, and self-reliance. They had built a life based on image, favor, and the suppression of others. One was a castle on a rock, the other was a sandcastle at high tide. I was finally at peace with being the invisible daughter. I decided to use a portion of my wealth to start a foundation for young women who were struggling to start their own businesses. I wanted to provide the mentorship and resources I never had. I called it the foundation of silence. I wanted to teach them that they didn't need to shout to be heard. They just needed to build something undeniable. I spent my time traveling, learning, and growing. My name became synonymous with innovation and integrity in the tech world. Occasionally, I would see a news clipping about Andrew's legal troubles or my parents' complaints about their living situation. I would send a silent wish for their growth, but I no longer let their shadows dim my light. I had moved beyond the need for their recognition. I was finally, truly free. A year later, I received a letter from Andrew. He was working an entry-level job at a warehouse and living in a tiny apartment. The letter was short. He didn't apologize, but he did admit that he had been wrong about my lack of drive. He said he finally understood how hard it was to start over from nothing. I didn't reply, but I did keep the letter. It was a small piece of evidence that even the most arrogant hearts can be humbled by the weight of reality. My parents eventually stopped asking for money and started asking for my time. We began to rebuild a relationship on my terms, with clear boundaries and a mutual understanding that I was no longer the girl they could dismiss. It was a slow process, but it was honest. And honesty was a new language for us. I realized that my journey wasn't really about the money or the company. It was about the reclamation of my own worth. I had been taught to believe I was a burden, and I had nearly stayed in that basement forever. But the humiliation I faced at that reunion had been a gift in disguise. It had stripped away my illusions and forced me to choose between a slow death of the soul or a difficult birth of a new life. I chose life. I chose to be the architect of my own destiny. And while the world might still worship the loud and the confident like Andrew, I knew that the real power lies in the quiet, the focused, and the persistent. The invisible ones are often the ones moving the world. I was proud to be one of them. Now, as I sit in my garden, surrounded by the beauty I created with my own hands, I think back to that sunset in Denver. I think of the girl who felt her dignity being dismantled over a grill. If I could go back, I wouldn't change a single thing. I wouldn't stop Andrew from speaking, and I wouldn't stop my parents from nodding. That pain was the compass that pointed me toward my true north. I am Natalie Whitaker, and I am no one's burden. My success didn't just prove them wrong, it set me free from the need to prove anything at all. I am enough. I have always been enough. And as the stars begin to appear over the mountains, I know that my story is just beginning. Silence is not weakness. It is the sound of a foundation being built.